Watch me as I repair this duckling from this to this. This is a 1960s or early 1970s vintage plastic duckling. It was probably an Easter decoration. It's in pretty good shape overall, but obviously the eyes have been worn off over time, and I'm going to be repainting them as accurately as possible. The first step here was to take off the duckling's head. I heated up the plastic just a little bit by running it under some sort of warm or hot water to just soften the plastic and make it a bit easier for his head to come off. This plastic is really brittle because it is so old. It's thinning at points, but I carefully took it off and sort of assessed how much of the eyes have been worn off over the years. The first step here was to remove the old paint so we could start brand new, and I took some pure acetone and started dabbing it and rubbing it across the eye. I found the most success when I let it pool up a little bit, wait a few seconds, and just rubbed it off. And as you can see, the paint really did come right off. I took a little paintbrush with some acetone and used that to really get into the corners of the plastic. And as you can see, it looks brand new. There's no paint, and we have a clean slate to paint on. For reference on how the eye should look, I did a lot of eBay searching, and I also have this plastic chick of my own that I could sort of look at the color of the eyes and how the pupil is positioned to decide how I want to paint the ones on my duckling. To get the most accurate look, I would have had to use an airbrush, which I don't have, so we're just going to use regular paint and regular paint brushes, and it should work pretty well as long as I'm careful to, really give it a natural airbrushed look. Back in the day, they did use an airbrush on this duck's face, but like I said, we're just going to mix them some paint. I'm trying to match as closely as possible. I used a mix of blues and, importantly, some orange to sort of tone down how bright the blue is. I've never worked with plastic before, so I wasn't sure how the paint would sit on it, if it was going to be opaque or more translucent, but it actually showed up really nicely. So I just went in and carefully started painting the blue of the eye. I was liking how the color was looking, but I felt like it was a little too perfect and neat. I really wanted that airbrush look, so I actually went in with a smaller brush and started painting over the line to give it a softer look. I then went back in with some acetone on my brush to really soften up that line, and even used a skewer to get into the cracks and just clean it up exactly how I wanted it to look. Feeling pretty good at this point, so it was time to move on to the scariest part of this all, which is painting the pupil. I mixed up some black and used some white to sort of tone down how intense and dark that black is to get a color more accurate to what it would have originally looked like. I thinned the paint down a little bit with some water so it would really move nicely on the paintbrush, and slowly started to just get an idea of how I wanted the pupil to look, how big I wanted to. I started off with a circle, which probably is the hardest way. I usually just start with like a blob and build it out, but I just had to go in the moment, see what I was feeling, and start with some type of circle. So I'll go in here, start filling out the circle and building it out. The hardest part about this is that you can always add more paint. You can always make that pupil bigger, but once you add down the paint, if you need to remove it, you're going to be taking off all the paint, so all the blue. So I was really careful to make sure that I was going slow, meticulously, and making sure that I wasn't rushing it so that I didn't make a mistake and have to start all over. I like this side and I moved on to the next. And this side I think was a little bit easier for some reason, maybe because I had done it once before, but I just started off with a dot and started building up the paint around it a little bit more thicker and a little bit faster. And here I also want to make sure to match the positioning of the pupil from the other side. So really making sure that it is placed right where I like it to be. As you can see, the pupil has a really harsh line, so I actually went in with a dry brush technique to soften that black line and give it more of an airbrush look. Dry brushing is when you use quite literally a dry brush, dip it in a tiny bit of paint, wipe off the excess, and the dryness of the brush sort of helps to spread the paint in a way that looks more airbrushed, looks more soft, doesn't really give it as harsh of a line. So you can see the line is sort of starting to soften just a bit. I'm trying to recreate that airbrush look that was on the original. Here's the difference from dry brush to not being dry brushed. I think there's a difference. It's softer, it looks a little bit more natural. And the second most hardest part is that highlight. I use the end of a brush, dip it in some white paint, just straight white paint, and hope that that placement is exactly where I want it and that it looks good, and do it on the other side. I try not to think about it too much, and that's usually how they come out the best and most even and uniform. I'm pretty happy with this, but we have one more step. that white highlight is really bright in comparison to the rest of the eye. So I take some chalk pastel in a sort of dark brown color and start to press it in and brush it over the pupil. I want to give it a look like it's 60 years old. So I'm just pressing it in and brushing away the excess until I get it to a color that I'm happy with. And sort of the color of the chalk helps to make the whole eye look a little aged. I carefully put the head back on, and there you have it. That's pretty much it. I think it came out pretty good. I do think it would have been more accurate if I had been airbrushing it, but obviously we didn't do that here, and I think this is pretty good considering the supplies that I had on hand. I'm really happy to bring new life to the 60-year-old duckling, and he'll be happy this Easter on display with the rest of his vintage Easter friends. Thanks so much for joining me, guys. If you have any tips of your own on how to repair vintage pieces, make sure to drop them in the comments. See you guys next time. Bye!